Hi, I'm Mr. Simons, and in this video we're going to take a look at a forecast for the Australian economy in 2020. And not just one forecast, we're going to look at 21 forecasts that have been combined together. So the reason I'm doing this is that I created a previous video that looked at forecasts for the Australian economy in 2020, and quite frankly, they were pretty optimistic. And I think it's important to share with you a range of views about how the Australian economy is expected to perform in 2020 and 2021. And that this is important because we want to think about, well, what is likely to happen, what does happen, and then how does this relate to the economic theory? If we can include elements of that in our answers as economic students, we're really trying to connect the theory with the real world events and the forecasts, and this can elevate our answers. So let's start with a little bit of background about the survey. So what happened was the Sydney Morning Herald, a newspaper based in, Sydney, Australia, surveyed 21 economists about their views of the Australian economy over the next 2 years, mainly about 2020. And that in terms of what they were asked about things like growth rates, wages, unemployment, China, and global growth. All of the really important elements here. So in terms of a headline finding or an overall kind of statement, that the economists believed, sort of on average or as a whole, that Australian households will face another year of slow wages growth, growing unemployment, and sort of little hope or little optimism for businesses, with struggles in the global economy, but ultra low interest rates are likely to remain. So this is the kind of top level finding. If we then break it down a little bit, let's start with interest rates. So the economists surveyed thought that the RBA would keep interest rates, would keep the cash rate, the official interest rate, ultra low in 2020 and through 2021. So at the time I'm making this video in February 2020, the cash rate is at 0.75%, which is a record low. That all economists except for one surveyed thought that the RBA would bring the cash rate down to 0.5% by June of this year. So after the RBA meets on the first Tuesday of June, that the cash rate will be at least 0.5%. So that's sort of one move between now and midway through the year. Something else to think about, which I thought was quite interesting. The economists surveyed, most of them thought that the cash rate would be 0.25% by the middle of 2021. So that, again, most economists surveyed thought that the RBA will cut the cash rate to 0.25% by midway through 2021. That's a very, very low level. That's almost 0% in terms of the official interest rate. So this really shows that the economists believe that the Australian economy still has quite weak growth, very low inflation, and that the RBA won't hesitate to go much further in cutting the cash rate. Let's move to growth now. And the thing to remember with growth is that the Australian government has a goal for economic growth of around 3 to 4% in terms of annual GDP growth. Now, the economists surveyed from this article believe growth will be around 2.2%. So pretty weak, sort of very much outside of that goal range, and really continuing that weak growth from 2019. So this could also be another reason why economists think that rates can go lower, is because Australia's economic growth remains pretty weak overall. In terms of employment and wages, that the average expectation for unemployment in 2020 is 5.3%, which is not too far from where it is at the moment in February 2020. So unemployment not coming down in any significant terms, and wages growth also being pretty weak. In terms of looking at the link with unemployment and wages growth, that unemployment really needs to come down, that cyclical unemployment really needs to shrink so that there is pressure, upward pressure on wages. Because if you think about it, if there's relatively high unemployment and there's people out there that could work but don't have jobs, then employers can very easily find new staff without having to increase wages. If unemployment shrinks and there are fewer people out there to pick up in terms of filling jobs, then firms might need to offer higher wages, increase inflation, and so on. Something to think about is that the RBA's level, or the RBA's forecast for the NIRU, the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, is 4.5%. Essentially what this is saying is that once the unemployment rate gets to 4.5%, then any movements lower are likely to boost up prices. So what it's saying is that there is quite a bit of slack or unused capacity in the Australian labour market, and that by reducing that slack, by reducing unemployment further, wages could lift a bit, inflation could lift a bit, and that growth could be a little bit stronger. Our next thing to have a look at is, well, what's going to happen with the global economy? Because remember, Australia is so heavily linked to the global economy that whatever happens globally will then affect Australia, and particularly whatever happens in China will then have a big impact on Australia's own economic growth. So if we have a look at the findings from the survey, that the economists surveyed believe China's economy will expand by 5.9% through 2020, that China's economic growth through 2020 could be 5.9%. Now, this is a very low growth rate. In fact, if this was to happen, if China had growth of 5.9%, this would be the lowest growth rate since the start of the 1990s. That's very low. And that it's not just China's growth is low, it's that if China is growing at a slow pace, then it is demanding fewer Australian exports. That is then reducing aggregate demand in Australia and further putting pressure on Australia's economic growth. What's also interesting to note is this relatively pessimistic view of the Chinese economy was done before the full effects of the coronavirus were known. So China's economic growth could be even smaller because of all the economic slowdown due to the impacts of the virus, which would then have a further negative impact on Australia's economic growth. But we don't know that for sure just yet, because the Chinese government might be putting in stimulus measures and other economic growth measures to try and counteract the effects of the coronavirus on its economy. The other thing to note is that the global economy as a whole, so China, America, and everyone, was expected to grow by 2.9% in 2020, and that would be the worst performance since the global financial crisis in 2008, which would then have negative implications for Australia because of how heavily integrated Australia is with the global economy. Now, obviously, none of this is guaranteed. These are only forecasts, but it's very important to know what economists are thinking, why they're thinking that, how that could link to the Australian economy, and then to compare it with what actually happens. So I'm going to link to the article in the description, including the very useful section where you can play around with the forecasts and see what economists are thinking. Any questions or thoughts, just put them in the comments. And as always, thank you very much for watching.